Every single thought you've had today changed your brain. Not metaphorically, physically. A synapse fired. A connection strengthened. A tiny piece of the 3-pound organ behind your eyes rearranged itself, just slightly, based on what you paid attention to. Here's the strange part. You didn't choose most of those thoughts. They were on autopilot, the same worn grooves your brain has been running for years. The same anxious spiral before a hard conversation, the same self-doubt right before you speak up in a meeting, the same reach for your phone the second you feel bored or uncomfortable. That's not a character flaw. That's neuroscience. And the good news is this. Anything that can be wired can be rewired. This isn't a video about mindset quotes or willpower. It's about what neuroscientists actually know about how the brain changes, why most people fail to change it, and exactly what to do instead. By the end of this hour, you'll understand the real mechanism behind personal change, and you'll walk away with a specific, evidence-based plan for using it. Not vague inspiration and actual protocol. Let's start by killing a myth. You've probably heard that your personality is basically fixed by your mid-20s, that the brain finishes its major construction somewhere around then and just slowly declines from there. For a long time, scientists believed that too. The adult brain, they thought, was a finished structure. No new rooms, no renovations, just wear and tear. That turned out to be wrong. And it turned out to be wrong in a way that changes what's actually possible for you, right now, regardless of your age or how long you've had a particular pattern. The brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new neural connections throughout the entire lifespan, is called neuroplasticity. This isn't a fringe theory or a self-help buzzword. It's one of the most well-established findings in modern neuroscience, built on decades of research using brain imaging, stroke rehabilitation studies, and controlled animal models. Stroke patients who lose function in one part of the brain can, with the right kind of repeated practice, recruit and retrain other regions to take over lost functions. That only works because the adult brain remains structurally changeable. Here's the mechanism in plain terms, because understanding this changes how you'll approach everything else in this video. Your brain is made of roughly 86 billion neurons. They don't touch each other directly. They communicate across tiny gaps called synapses using electrical and chemical signals. Every thought you have, every action you take, every emotional reaction that fires through your body is a specific pattern of neurons activating together in sequence. Here's the rule that changes everything. First described by psychologist Donald Hebb back in 1949 and confirmed and refined by decades of research since. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When two neurons activate at the same time repeatedly, the connection between them physically strengthens. The synapse becomes more efficient. Signals travel faster and with less resistance along that specific path the next time it's triggered. This process is called long-term potentiation. It's the leading biological explanation for how memory and habit actually get built into brain tissue, not as a metaphor for how habits work as a real, measurable, physical change in synaptic strength that researchers can observe directly. Think of it like a path through tall grass. The first time you walk it, you're pushing through resistance. It's slow, effortful, awkward, easy to lose. Walk that same path 5 times, and it starts to become visible. Walk it 50 times, and the grass is trampled flat. Walk it for months, and it becomes the easiest route through the whole field. Your feet go there automatically. without a single conscious decision. That's what a habit is. That's what an emotional reaction pattern is. That's what a core belief about yourself is, at the level of brain tissue. Grooves worn into neural pathways through repetition, nothing more mystical than that. And here's the flip side, which matters just as much as the first half of this principle. Paths that don't get walked fade. Neuroscientists call this synaptic pruning. The connections you stop using get progressively weaker over time and are eventually recycled by the brain for other purposes. This happens constantly, across your entire life, not just during childhood development. Your brain is always asking, quietly, in the background, is this pathway still being used? If the answer is consistently no, the resources supporting it get reallocated. So when someone tells you, I'm just not a confident person, or I've always been anxious, that's just who I am. What they're actually describing, whether they realize it or not, is a well-worn path, not a life sentence, not a fixed identity carved into the architecture of who they are. A path. Built by repetition over years, usually starting in childhood or adolescence when the brain is especially plastic and highly influenced by environment. And any path can be rerouted given the right conditions. One of the clearest real-world demonstrations of this comes from an unlikely place: London taxi drivers. To get fully licensed in London, drivers have to memorize the layout of over 25,000 streets across the city, a grueling process that typically takes 2 to 4 years of study, known simply as the knowledge. Researchers scanned the brains of trainee drivers before they started this process and scanned them again after they qualified. What they found was measurable structural growth in the hippocampus, specifically the posterior hippocampus, the brain region heavily involved in spatial memory and navigation. Their brains had physically restructured themselves, growing new tissue, in direct response to sustained, demanding mental practice. If sustained repetition can grow new tissue in a taxi driver's hippocampus over the course of a few years, it can absolutely rewire the neural patterns underneath your habits, your emotional reactions, and the story you tell yourself about who you are. So if the mechanism is genuinely this simple: repeat what you want to strengthen, neglect what you want to fade, why does change feel so difficult in practice? Why do so many people set out with real motivation and still end up back where they started a few weeks later? That's what we need to look at next, because understanding exactly where change attempts break down is what separates people who successfully rewire long-standing patterns from people who spend years cycling through the same failed attempts. If rewiring the brain were as simple as just repeat the new thing a few times, everyone would succeed at every New Year's resolution, every new me declaration, every fresh start after a hard breakup or a bad year. They don't. Study after study on habit change shows the exact same pattern: a surge of motivation, a few weeks of real effort, and then a collapse back into the old groove. This isn't a willpower problem, and treating it like one is actually part of why it keeps happening. It's a misunderstanding of the mechanism. Let's go through the 4 biggest reasons rewiring attempts fail, and what the actual science points to instead. The first failure point is treating change like a single dramatic event rather than a repeated process. People often try to rewire a pattern through one big push, a breakthrough seminar, an emotional rock-bottom moment. A heartfelt, this time is different declaration, sometimes written down in a journal at midnight with real conviction behind it. And in that moment, it genuinely feels transformative. It feels like something has shifted permanently. But one intense experience, no matter how emotionally significant it felt in the moment, creates only a faint single trace in neural tissue. Long-term potentiation requires repeated activation over time to produce a durable structural change. A single walk through the tall grass doesn't create a path. It barely bends a few blades, and within days the grass has mostly sprung back. This is exactly why the version of you that exists right after a motivational weekend, or right after a powerful conversation with a therapist, or right after finishing an inspiring book, so often fails to survive contact with a completely normal Tuesday 2 weeks later. The old neural pathway is still there. It's still stronger. It's still the path of least resistance for your brain to default to under stress or fatigue. Nothing has structurally changed yet, because structural change requires volume of repetition over time, not intensity of a single emotional moment. The second failure point is attempting a new behavior with no cue attached to trigger it. Habits, both old and new, run on a loop. A cue triggers a routine, which produces some kind of reward, which reinforces the entire loop and makes it more likely to fire again next time the cue appears. Your existing patterns, the ones you're trying to change, already have strong, deeply automatic cues wired into them. Feeling bored triggers reaching for your phone. Feeling criticized triggers a defensive response before you've even consciously registered what was said. Feeling anxious triggers avoidance of the thing causing the anxiety. New behaviors you're trying to build, by contrast, usually have no cue at all attached to them. You just hope, vaguely, that you'll remember to do the new thing at some point during your day. And relying on memory and raw willpower to override an automatic, deeply cued pattern is simply an unfair fight from the start. Willpower is a limited, fatigable resource that depletes over the course of a day, especially under stress. Automatic cue response loops are not limited in that same way. They fire instantly without requiring any conscious effort at all. The practical fix, which we'll build out in detail later in this video, is something called habit stacking. Deliberately attaching your new behavior to a cue that already reliably happens in your day, borrowing the automaticity of an existing habit to carry the new one. The third failure point is a lack of emotional reinforcement. The brain does not wire in behaviors equally, regardless of how many times you repeat them. It prioritizes wiring in anything tied to strong emotion, positive or negative. This is exactly why a single traumatic event can create a phobia lasting decades, while neutral, emotionally flat repetition of something barely leaves a lasting trace at all. Most people try to build new habits in a completely flat, emotionally neutral way, gritting their teeth through it, treating it purely as an obligation to check off a list, feeling essentially nothing when it's finished. That's a slow, weak signal to send to your brain about how much this particular pathway actually matters. Compare that to someone who does the exact same small action, say, going for a short walk after a hard day, but who actually pauses afterward and genuinely notices, I feel noticeably better right now. I'm proud that I did that even though I didn't feel like it. That small moment of real felt reward is doing genuine neurological work in the background. It's tagging the new pathway as significant, worth remembering, worth strengthening using the exact same biological tagging system that makes emotionally significant memories stick so vividly for years. The fourth and final failure point is subtle, but it might be the most important one to understand. A lot of people try to change by suppressing the old pattern directly, rather than building a competing one. White-knuckling through the urge to snap at someone, forcefully telling themselves not to think the anxious thought, trying through sheer effort to simply not do the old thing anymore. Suppression research consistently shows that trying hard not to think about something tends to backfire and actually keeps that exact thought more active in your mind, not less. Telling yourself don't be anxious about this keeps the anxious circuit firing, because your brain has to keep referencing the very thing you're trying to avoid in order to avoid it. You cannot rewire a well-worn path simply by staring at it and refusing to walk down it out of sheer determination. You rewire it by deliberately, repeatedly walking a different path instead, consistently, until that new path becomes the easier, more automatic one for your brain to default to. This is genuinely the single biggest mindset shift in this entire video, so it's worth saying clearly, you are not trying to delete the old pattern through force. You are trying to build a competing pathway strong enough that your brain naturally prefers it under normal conditions. Eventually, given enough time and neglect, the old path fades on its own from disuse. You don't need to fight it directly. You need to outbuild it. Now that we understand exactly why most change attempts break down, let's move into the 5 things neuroscience actually shows drive lasting, durable rewiring. These aren't abstract principles. Each one has direct, practical application, and together they form the backbone of everything that follows in this video. The first pillar is spaced repetition. We've already covered the underlying why behind this long-term potentiation requires repeated activation over time. Let's cover the specific how much and how often, because the numbers here genuinely matter and most popular advice gets them wrong. A widely cited study on habit formation, led by health psychology researcher Philippa Lally at University College London, tracked real people trying to build new habits in their everyday lives, things like drinking a glass of water at breakfast, or doing a short set of sit-ups after their morning coffee. On average, across the group, it took about 66 days for a new behavior to become genuinely automatic, meaning it no longer required conscious effort or willpower to perform. But the range across individuals and behaviors was wide, anywhere from about 18 days for the simplest habits up to nearly 254 days for more complex ones involving multiple steps or significant lifestyle change. So the popular claim that it takes 21 days to build a habit isn't actually well supported by the research it's usually attributed to. That number got popular because it sounds quick and achievable, not because the data actually backs it up. The realistic range to plan around, based on the strongest available evidence, is roughly 2 to 3 months of consistent daily repetition, sometimes longer depending on the complexity of what you're trying to build. Critically, the same research also found something practically important. Missing a single day here or there did not meaningfully damage the overall habit formation process, as long as the person got back on track relatively quickly afterward. What did meaningfully damage the process was long, extended gaps and general inconsistency stretched out over time. Your brain, it turns out, cares much more about the overall reliability of the pattern than it does about flawless, unbroken perfection. So the practical takeaway here is straightforward. Don't judge a new pattern as either working or not working after just one good week. And don't abandon it entirely after a single missed day out of guilt or frustration. Commit to the daily repetition for the better part of 2 to 3 months before you seriously evaluate whether this new behavior has actually become part of who you are now. The second pillar is emotional salience, which we touched on earlier as a failure point. Now, let's talk about how to use it deliberately and on purpose. A small, almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala plays a central role in tagging experiences as emotionally significant and worth remembering strongly. When something is emotionally charged, your brain treats it as important information that deserves to be encoded deeply and recalled easily later. This is deeply adaptive from an evolutionary standpoint. It's exactly why you never forget touching a hot stove after doing it just once as a child. You can deliberately use this same system for constructive change, not just for survival-based learning. Here's specifically how. After you complete a new behavior, even a very small or partial version of it, stop for roughly 10 to 15 seconds and deliberately notice a genuine, real positive feeling about having done it. Not performative enthusiasm or forced positivity, a quiet, honest acknowledgement to yourself, I did that. That mattered. I'm someone who does this now, even if it was small. This isn't self-help fluff dressed up as science. It's a direct way of manually triggering the same neurological tagging mechanism that makes emotionally significant memories stick so vividly and so quickly, sometimes after just one exposure. Behavioral researchers who study tiny habits specifically emphasize this exact technique, pairing a small new behavior with an immediate. Genuine positive emotion is one of the most reliable ways to make that behavior stick, because the brain wires in what feels rewarding far faster and far more durably than it wires in what merely feels neutral or effortful. Contrast that deliberate practice with grinding resentfully through a new habit day after day, treating it purely as a chore to survive and get through. Structurally, from your brain's point of view, that's a dramatically weaker signal. You're technically performing the behavior, repetition after repetition, but you're not tagging it as something genuinely worth keeping and strengthening. The third pillar is focused attention, and this is a finding that genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it. Repetition alone is not sufficient for rewiring to occur. The repetition, specifically, has to be attended to consciously while it's happening. Pioneering plasticity researcher Michael Merzenich demonstrated this clearly in landmark studies. When test subjects received repeated sensory stimulation but weren't actively paying attention to it, almost no meaningful cortical reorganization occurred in the brain afterward, when the exact same stimulation was instead paired with active, focused attention. The relevant brain maps reorganized significantly and measurably. In human terms, this means mindlessly going through the physical motions of meditating while your mind wanders off through your grocery list and your unanswered emails is simply not the same, neurologically, as actually attending closely to your breath, moment by moment. Scrolling through your phone while telling yourself you're practicing patience in the background is not meaningfully building the neural pathway for patience, no matter how many times you repeat that story to yourself. This is genuinely one of the most practically important findings in this entire video, because it directly explains why some people can go through the motions of a new habit for months on end and still see almost no real change in themselves. They were physically present for the repetitions, but they were not attentionally present. The practical rule that follows from this is simple. 5 minutes of genuinely focused, attentive practice will rewire more of your brain than 30 minutes of distracted, half-present repetition. If you're already committing the time, make sure you're also committing the attention, because without it, the time alone accomplishes very little. The fourth pillar is sleep. And this is a piece that most personal development advice completely ignores or treats as an afterthought. None of the first 3 pillars we've covered actually finish their job during the day when you're performing the repetition. They finish that job later, while you sleep. During sleep, particularly during deep, slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, the brain actively replays and consolidates the significant neural activity from earlier in the day, strengthening the specific connections that were activated and emotionally reinforced during your waking hours. This process is known as synaptic consolidation, and sleep researchers, including Matthew Walker at UC Berkeley, have demonstrated clearly that this process is essential for converting a single day's repeated experience into a durable, lasting structural change in the brain rather than a fleeting one that fades by the next day. In very practical terms, this means that if you do everything else right during the day, focused practice, genuine emotional reinforcement, consistent repetition, and then get only 4 hours of fragmented, poor-quality sleep that night, you are actively undercutting a significant portion of that day's work before it ever gets properly consolidated into lasting neural structure. This is why chronic sleep deprivation is consistently associated in the research with poorer memory consolidation, weaker emotional regulation, and noticeably slower skill acquisition across a wide range of studies. If you're genuinely serious about rewiring any pattern in your life, sleep isn't a nice-to-have you can trim around the edges of your plan when things get busy. It's a core, non-negotiable part of the actual biological mechanism you're relying on. The fifth and final pillar is aerobic exercise. And this one is a bit different from the first 4 because it changes your brain's underlying overall capacity to rewire rather than directly strengthening one specific pathway you happen to be working on. Aerobic exercise reliably raises levels of a protein in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, usually abbreviated as BDNF. This protein supports the growth of new neurons and directly strengthens the underlying cellular machinery responsible for synaptic plasticity in general. Researchers sometimes describe BDNF, somewhat loosely but usefully, as acting like fertilizer for the brain's overall ability to grow, adapt, and change. Studies on aerobic exercise and cognitive function, including notable work by neuroscientist John Ratey, have found consistent links between regular cardiovascular exercise and measurably improved learning, memory, and mood regulation across many different populations. It's one of the very few interventions that doesn't just support one specific new habit you're trying to build, it actually raises the overall ceiling on how plastic and adaptable your entire brain is capable of being during this period. You don't need to become a serious athlete for this benefit to apply to you. The research generally points to moderate aerobic activity, brisk walking, light jogging, cycling at a comfortable pace for roughly 20 to 30 minutes several times a week as sufficient to produce measurable BDNF elevation and real cognitive benefit over time. So to summarize these 5 pillars before we move into the practical protocol: spaced repetition sustained over roughly 8 to 10 weeks or longer, consistency valued over occasional intensity, emotional salience, meaning you deliberately manufacture a genuine felt sense of reward after each repetition, rather than waiting passively for motivation to show up, focused attention, since plasticity itself is gated by how much you're actually attending to what you're doing in the moment. Protected sleep, since consolidation of everything you practiced happens overnight, not during the repetition itself, and regular aerobic exercise, which raises your brain's overall capacity to adapt and change in the first place. Let's make these 5 pillars concrete with a couple of real-world examples, because abstract principles are easy to nod along to and hard to actually apply under pressure on a Tuesday afternoon. Take someone trying to rewire a pattern of chronic people-pleasing, saying yes to requests they don't have capacity for, then feeling resentful afterward. The old pathway here is deeply reinforced. Every time they say yes against their own interest, they get an immediate reward, the other person's approval, a brief flash of relief from conflict avoidance. That's a powerful, well-practiced loop. Rewiring it doesn't mean forcing themselves to become someone who says no to everything. It means building one specific small competing behavior, for instance. When a request comes in, pausing and saying, "Let me check and get back to you," rather than answering immediately. That single pause, repeated dozens of times, becomes its own pathway. Early on, it will feel unnatural and slightly uncomfortable, exactly the way the taxi driver's early attempts to recall unfamiliar streets felt effortful before the route became second nature. But repeated with attention, reinforced with a genuine felt sense of relief or pride each time they follow through, protected by decent sleep and supported by regular movement. That pause becomes automatic within a couple of months. At that point, saying no when appropriate stops requiring willpower and starts requiring almost nothing at all, because the new pathway has become the default one. Or take someone trying to rewire chronic procrastination on a specific type of task, say replying to emails that feel emotionally loaded. The old pattern is avoidance, see the email, feel a flicker of dread, close the tab, tell themselves they'll deal with it later. Each time they avoid it, they get immediate relief, which is exactly the kind of reward that strengthens a pathway quickly, even though it creates long-term cost. The rewiring approach isn't just stop procrastinating that's a vague identity goal, not a specific behavior. It's something like, the moment dread appears when looking at that email, open it and write one sentence of a reply, even a rough one, within the next 60 seconds. That's small enough to survive a bad day. It's cued directly by the feeling of dread itself, which means the trigger is unavoidable and reliable, and when they follow through, even imperfectly, they pause and notice, I did the hard thing instead of avoiding it. That's worth acknowledging. Do that consistently for 2 months, protected by good sleep and regular movement, and the association between dread and avoidance genuinely starts to weaken, while the association between dread and immediate small action starts to strengthen in its place. Notice what both of these examples have in common. Neither one starts with the big final version of the change. Neither one relies on suppressing the old urge through sheer force. Both attach the new behavior to something that already reliably happens, a request coming in, a feeling of dread appearing rather than hoping the person remembers to act at some arbitrary point in their day. That's the pattern we're about to formalize into a repeatable protocol. It's also worth addressing a common obstacle directly, because it comes up for almost everyone attempting this kind of change. What happens when you miss a day or several days in a row? This is where a lot of people quietly give up, not because the method failed, but because they interpret a lapse as proof that they don't have what it takes. Remember what the research on habit formation actually showed. A single missed day does not meaningfully damage the underlying process. What damages it is treating that single missed day as evidence of failure and abandoning the pattern entirely as a result. The technical term some habit researchers use for this is the never miss twice rule. Missing once is data. Missing twice in a row is where an old pattern starts to reassert itself as the default. So if you miss a day, the only rule that matters is getting back to the behavior the very next opportunity you have, without adding a layer of guilt or self-criticism on top of it. Self-criticism itself, interestingly, tends to activate threat-related circuitry in the brain that makes follow-through harder, not easier. Treating a lapse matter-of-factly, the way you'd note that you forgot to charge your phone one night, keeps the emotional tone neutral enough that you can simply resume the next day without the whole effort collapsing under the weight of shame. Another obstacle worth naming directly: plateaus. Somewhere around 3 or 4 weeks into a new pattern, many people report a strange dip. The initial novelty and motivation have worn off, but the behavior doesn't yet feel fully automatic either. This is often exactly the point where the pathway is being actively strengthened at the neural level, even though it doesn't yet feel that way subjectively. This is not the moment to question whether the whole approach is working. It's the moment to lean most heavily on the structural supports the cue, the small size of the behavior, the deliberate emotional tagging rather than relying on motivation, which by this point has predictably faded. Motivation was only ever meant to get you through the first few repetitions. After that, the system itself is supposed to carry the weight. Now let's turn these 5 pillars into an actual, usable system, a 6-step protocol you can start applying today, not next month once conditions feel perfect. Step 1 is getting specific. The single most common mistake people make is targeting a vague identity rather than a specific, repeatable behavior. Saying "I want to be more confident" gives your brain absolutely nothing concrete to actually repeat. There's no specific neural pathway available to strengthen, because there's no specific, observable action attached to that vague desire. Compare that vague goal to something like this instead. When someone asks a question in a meeting, I will be the first person to answer, even if my answer is imperfect. That's specific. That's genuinely repeatable. That's something you can actually practice 50 separate times over a few months and feel the underlying pathway measurably strengthen with each repetition. So take whatever change you're hoping to make and ask yourself directly, what is the exact observable physical behavior version of this? Not the feeling you eventually want to have as a result, the specific action you'll actually take today and tomorrow and the day after that. Step 2 is attaching the new behavior to an existing cue. Remember, new behaviors reliably fail without some kind of trigger attached to them. This is where habit stacking comes in, a concept popularized by behavior researcher James Clear and built directly on earlier foundational work from Stanford researcher B.J. Fogg. The formula is genuinely simple. After a specific thing you already reliably do every day, you will perform your new target behavior. The existing habit becomes the cue for the new one, borrowing its already established automaticity rather than trying to build automaticity completely from scratch. For example, after I pour my morning coffee, I will write down one thing I've been avoiding and take one small step on it. After I sit down at my desk each morning, I will take 3 slow breaths before opening my email. After I brush my teeth at night, I will write one single sentence about something that went reasonably well that day. This step matters more than almost anything else in this entire protocol, because it directly solves the exact problem relying purely on memory that quietly kills most change attempts before they even really get started. Step 3 is starting absurdly small. People consistently set the first version of a new habit far too big and demanding right out of the gate, then fail to keep it up, and then wrongly conclude they simply lack discipline, when in reality they just designed a plan that was genuinely difficult to execute consistently from day one. If your ultimate goal is a daily meditation practice, the very first version of that behavior isn't 20 minutes of sitting. It's 1 single minute. If your goal is regular exercise, the first version isn't a 5-mile run 3 times a week. It's simply putting your shoes on and stepping outside the front door. This isn't about staying small forever. It's specifically about reliably winning the first 10 to 15 repetitions so consistently that the behavior itself becomes automatic, and only then gradually scaling up the intensity or duration from that solid foundation. A weak, minimal version of the pathway that fires every single day will beat a stronger, more ambitious version of the pathway that only fires twice a week every time over the long run. Step 4 is adding the emotional tag deliberately every single time. Immediately after each repetition, at least consistently for the first several weeks, take about 10 seconds to genuinely notice that you did it. Not a mental checkbox ticked off automatically, an actual felt moment of acknowledgement. Some people find it helpful to say a short phrase out loud, something like, "That's who I am now." Some people simply pause quietly and let themselves feel a small, genuine flicker of pride. The specific method here matters far less than doing it consistently every time. This is the exact step most people unconsciously skip entirely, and it's a significant part of why their repetitions don't end up sticking nearly as strongly as they otherwise could. Step 5 is protecting the consolidation window, and importantly, this step doesn't happen during your actual practice at all. It happens later that same night while you sleep. Prioritize both the duration and the consistency of your sleep schedule, especially during the specific weeks you're actively working to build a new pattern. If you're genuinely serious about rewiring something meaningful in your life, this particular season is not the time to be chronically shortchanging your sleep for other priorities. Doing so means you'd be putting in the hard work of daily repetition and then quietly throwing away a meaningful chunk of its payoff before it ever gets the chance to properly consolidate overnight. Pair this consistently protected sleep with regular aerobic movement spread across the week. Even 3 separate 20-minute sessions is genuinely enough to keep your brain's overall plasticity elevated while you're doing this focused, deliberate work. Step 6 is tracking your progress and reviewing it honestly at the 8 to 10 week mark, not on day 3. Track your repetitions somehow. A simple check mark on a physical calendar or a basic note on your phone is entirely sufficient. This accomplishes 2 important things simultaneously. It gives you visible, concrete evidence of your progress over time, which is itself genuinely motivating on its own, and it keeps you honest about overall consistency rather than chasing an unrealistic standard of flawless perfection. And critically, don't evaluate whether this new pattern is working after just 3 days, or even after 2 full weeks. Based on the habit formation research we covered earlier in this video, give the process the better part of 2 to 3 full months before seriously deciding whether the new pattern has actually become automatic and self-sustaining. Most people quit right around the exact point where the underlying neural pathway was genuinely starting to strengthen in a meaningful, lasting way. Let's walk through what all 6 steps look like, stitched together, applied to one real example from start to finish. Because seeing the whole protocol in motion makes it far easier to apply to your own situation than hearing the steps listed in isolation. Say the change someone wants is to stop shutting down emotionally during disagreements, with their partner going quiet, withdrawing, and ending the conversation, rather than staying present through discomfort. Step 1. Getting specific turns that vague goal into an exact behavior. When I notice the urge to go quiet during a disagreement, I will say one sentence out loud, naming what I'm feeling. Even if it's just I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. That's concrete. That's something that either happened or didn't happen, with no ambiguity. Step 2 attaches it to a cue. In this case, the cue isn't a time of day, it's an internal sensation, the specific feeling of the throat tightening or the urge to look away that reliably precedes the old shutdown pattern. The new rule becomes: the moment that sensation appears, that's the trigger for the one-sentence check-in, not a signal to withdraw. Step 3 shrinks it down. The first version isn't a fully resolved, emotionally articulate conversation. It's one sentence. Just naming the feeling, nothing more required in the beginning. That's small enough to actually execute even in a moment of real discomfort, which is exactly when the old pattern is strongest. Step 4 adds the emotional tag. After saying that one sentence, even if the conversation remains difficult afterward, there's a deliberate pause to notice, I stayed present instead of disappearing. That's worth acknowledging, regardless of how the rest of the conversation goes. That felt acknowledgement is what tags the new pathway as significant. Step 5 protects the consolidation window around it, treating sleep as part of the plan during this period, not an afterthought. Along with some regular movement across the week, since both directly support the brain's capacity to consolidate this new pattern overnight. And step 6 tracks it with a simple mark on a calendar each time the new behavior happens, and a firm decision not to judge whether this is who I am now until roughly 2 to 3 months in, regardless of how any single disagreement goes in the meantime. Notice that nowhere in this example does the plan involve trying to force the old shutdown urge to disappear through sheer willpower. It involves building one small, specific, cued, emotionally reinforced competing behavior and repeating it consistently enough for long enough that it becomes the new default. That's the entire model, applied to a real situation instead of left as an abstract idea. Before we move to the honest limits of all this, let's run through a few of the questions that come up most often when people start applying this protocol, because these are usually the exact points where people get stuck or talk themselves out of continuing. The first question is, what if I want to change more than one thing at once? It's tempting, especially early on with a fresh burst of motivation, to try to overhaul several habits, simultaneously fix your sleep, start exercising, quit a bad habit, and build a new emotional response pattern, all in the same week. The research on self-regulation strongly suggests this backfires more often than it succeeds, because willpower and attention are both limited resources. And splitting them across several unfamiliar new pathways at once means none of them get the focused repetition they need to actually strengthen. The far more reliable approach is sequencing. Pick the one change that would make the biggest difference or that feels most urgent. Run the full protocol on it for several weeks until it's genuinely becoming automatic, and only then layer in the next one. Trying to rewire 5 pathways at once with divided attention is a slower path to change than rewiring one pathway completely and then moving to the next. The second common question is, what if the new behavior just doesn't feel natural, even after weeks of repetition? This is worth normalizing directly. Discomfort during the early weeks of a new pattern isn't a sign that something is wrong or that this particular approach doesn't work for you personally. It's a sign that the new pathway is still thinner and weaker than the old one, which is exactly what you'd expect this early in the process. The taxi driver memorizing London streets didn't suddenly find navigation effortless. After 2 weeks of study, it took years of sustained practice before those routes became truly automatic. Most everyday habits are obviously far simpler than memorizing 25,000 streets, but the underlying principle holds. Effort and unfamiliarity in the early weeks is the expected texture of rewiring in progress, not evidence of failure. The third question people frequently ask is, does this work the same way for deeply ingrained patterns that started in childhood versus habits picked up more recently as an adult? Patterns established early in life, particularly during childhood and adolescence, when the brain is unusually plastic and highly shaped by repeated environmental input, do tend to be more deeply worn, and correspondingly, they can take longer to meaningfully rewire. This doesn't mean they're unreachable. The same mechanism of long-term potentiation and synaptic pruning applies throughout life, as the plasticity research has repeatedly shown. It simply means the realistic timeline for a deeply established, decades-old pattern may run longer than the 2 to 3 month range we discussed for simpler habits. And it's worth setting that expectation honestly from the outset, rather than getting discouraged partway through by comparing your timeline to someone rewiring a much newer, shallower pattern. The fourth question worth addressing is whether professional support changes any of this. For patterns tied to significant past experiences, trauma, or clinical conditions like anxiety disorders or depression, the same underlying neuroplasticity principles apply, but the presence of a trained therapist meaningfully improves outcomes, partly because they can help identify the specific cue and pattern accurately in the first place, and partly because certain kinds of emotional processing genuinely benefit from professional guidance rather than being attempted entirely alone. Nothing in this video is meant to replace that kind of support where it's needed. This protocol is best understood as the general mechanism underlying change, applicable whether you're working on it independently or alongside a therapist or coach. Now, before we close, I want to be honest with you about something most videos in this particular space won't tell you directly. You cannot rewire your way into becoming a completely unlimited, fundamentally different person in some total sense. That's simply not how any of this actually works biologically. And claiming otherwise to you right now would be dishonest, regardless of how motivating it might sound in the moment. Traits like your baseline temperament, certain aspects of your natural emotional reactivity, and some core personality dimensions have real genetic and early developmental components behind them. A naturally introverted person can absolutely build genuine, comfortable social skills over time and meaningfully expand their overall range of behavior, but they may not simply wake up one day with the same baseline social energy as someone who is naturally extroverted from birth. Someone with a genuinely reactive nervous system can build real, lasting emotional regulation skills through consistent practice, but that underlying reactivity may still remain part of their raw biological material. Something to be skillfully managed rather than something that gets fully erased through repetition alone. That's not actually a discouraging fact once you sit with it for a moment. It's a genuinely clarifying one, because it points you directly toward what actually is within your control, rather than leaving you chasing an impossible, unlimited version of change. What's on the highly changeable list is not some small consolation prize by comparison. Habits, learned skills, recurring thought patterns, emotional response patterns specifically, as opposed to your underlying temperament itself. The way you talk to yourself internally, your specific reactions to specific known triggers, your daily routines and default behaviors. For almost everyone watching this, that list genuinely covers the overwhelming majority of what they actually mean, in practical terms, when they say they want to become a new person. You're not trying to replace your underlying temperament wholesale. You're trying to change what you consistently do with it, repetition after repetition, until the doing itself gradually becomes who you are. There's a related question worth addressing directly, because it comes up constantly. Does this mean identity change is fake? That you're just performing new behaviors without ever becoming a genuinely different person underneath? The research actually suggests the opposite. Identity, from a neuroscience perspective, isn't some separate, deeper thing sitting behind your behavior, quietly unaffected by what you repeatedly do. Identity is, to a significant degree, the brain's running summary of your own patterns of action over time. When you repeatedly perform a behavior, your brain doesn't just get better at the behavior itself, it updates its internal model of who you are, based on the evidence of what you've actually repeatedly done. This is why the small felt acknowledgement after each repetition matters so much. Saying to yourself, quietly, that's who I am now, after following through, isn't wishful thinking layered on top of the real work. It's an accurate description of what's happening biologically. You're not performing a new identity as a temporary act. You're generating the evidence your brain uses to construct your actual sense of self, one repetition at a time. It's also worth addressing the question of relapse into old patterns, especially under stress, because this is genuinely common and it doesn't mean the rewiring failed. Under high stress, fatigue, or emotional overwhelm, the brain reliably defaults to its oldest, most deeply worn pathways, simply because those pathways require the least cognitive effort to access. This is true even months into successfully building a new pattern. Seeing an old reaction resurface during an unusually hard week is not evidence that the new pathway was never real. It's a predictable feature of how stressed brains conserve effort. The path back to the new behavior after a stressful lapse is exactly the same as it was on day one. Notice it without excessive self-judgment. Return to the specific cued behavior at the next opportunity, and let the accumulated weeks of prior repetition do the work of making the return faster and easier than the original learning was. A pathway that's been reinforced for 2 months doesn't vanish after one hard week. It just gets temporarily outcompeted, and it reasserts itself quickly once you deliberately return to it. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. Every single thought you have today is either strengthening an old familiar pathway or beginning to build a new one, whether you're consciously aware of it happening or not. That's not a metaphor for how change works in some loose, inspirational sense. It's a literal description of what's physically happening in your synapses right now, in this exact moment, regardless of whether you're paying deliberate attention to it. The version of you that reacts anxiously under pressure, that avoids the hard conversation you know you need to have, that reaches for the phone instead of doing the meaningful work in front of you, that version of you isn't fixed or permanent. It's practiced, deeply practiced, over years through countless repetitions you likely never consciously chose. And anything that has been practiced that thoroughly can eventually be out-practiced by something else, given enough time and the right conditions. You don't need some dramatic breakthrough moment to start this process. You don't need to feel fully ready before you begin. You need one specific behavior, clearly defined, attached to a cue you already reliably have in your day. Small enough that you genuinely can't talk yourself out of doing it, even on a bad day. Repeated with real, focused attention rather than going through the motions on autopilot. Reinforced afterward with a real, felt sense of reward, however brief. Protected by genuinely adequate sleep so the work can actually consolidate overnight. Sustained consistently for roughly 2 to 3 months before you judge the results. That's the entire mechanism, laid out plainly. It's not mysterious, and it's not reserved for people with some special gift for self-discipline that you weren't born with. It's biology, and biology reliably responds to consistent repetition over time. So here's the only real homework from this video. Don't try to change everything about yourself all at once. That approach reliably fails for almost everyone who attempts it. Pick one specific behavior. Attach it to one existing cue in your day. Start today, and start it small enough that skipping it would feel almost silly. The path you want is already there. Faintly, somewhere in the tall grass. All that's genuinely left to do now is start walking it, one repetition at a time.